I'm Lynn Bassanese, the director of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all tonight. When FDR created this presidential library and gave his home to the American people, his hope was that people would visit here and learn from the past so they would be able to create a better future for themselves. That mission of discovery and learning is something we take very seriously here. And by welcoming visitors from all over the world to our beautiful new museum, offering interesting and innovative public programs, and by allowing community groups to use the wonderful spaces in this visitor center, we try very hard to fulfill that mission. The library is also home to 17 million pages of documents and one of the busiest research rooms in the presidential library system. Those historic documents form the basis for so many new books about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and they allow us to meet and get to know so many wonderful authors. And tonight, we're so pleased to welcome home an author that worked in our research room to craft a wonderful piece of Roosevelt history. In Roosevelt's second act, Richard Moe focuses on a turning point in American political history, FDR's decision to seek a third term. Often overlooked between the passage and implementation of the New Deal and the bombing of Pearl Harbor, that decision was far from inevitable. In an intricate and intriguing tale that it is an intricate and intriguing tale that Dick tells in a compelling and captivating narrative. Richard Moe was president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation from 1993 to 2010, chief of staff to Vice President Walter Mondale, and served on President Carter's senior staff. His books include The Last Full Measure, The Life and Death of the First Minnesota Volunteers, and Changing Places, Rebuilding Community in the Age of Sprawl. He lives in Washington, D.C. and Santa Fe, New Mexico, and we're so happy that he's here with us this evening. Mr. Moe will take questions after his talk, and then he will be available to sign books in our museum store. Please join me in welcoming Richard Moe.
Thank you, Lynn, very much. What a treat to be back here at Hyde Park. This is a place I love. It means a lot to me. Never more so than now, because I've had a full day's experience here, getting to know Lynn. What an extraordinary director, what an extraordinary leader this place has. 40 years of involvement in and commitment to Hyde Park. I think that deserves a round of applause. Cliff Lobby, thank you for arranging this. Cliff actually has arranged this event twice. The first time was during the government shutdown, so we had to reschedule it 6 months later. I know you all showed up that night anyway, but we just had to put it off. But I'm so impressed by this place because I had a full-bore experience today, as I had earlier, dealing with the archive. Bob Clark isn't here tonight, but he is one of the best archivists any historian could work with, and with a wonderful staff. I had a marvelous tour of the new museum, as I assume all of you have, and if you haven't, please get over there to see it. Herbert Eberhardt has just done a marvelous job with his staff. This is an extraordinary museum, a set of exhibits using a lot of interactive interpretive devices that I hadn't seen before, completely restoring the original office that FDR had here at Hyde Park. And then this morning, I saw Top Cottage for the first time with a wonderful park ranger who really understood the meaning of that place and what it meant to FDR. So everything kind of comes together here in FDR world, and I'm just enormously pleased and honored to be here, and thank you for coming. I wanted especially to thank my friend Michael Janeway from nearby Lakeville, Connecticut tonight. As some of you may know, he is an outstanding editor, teacher, author. He wrote The Fall of the House of Roosevelt, Brokers of Ideas and Powers from FDR to LBJ. He knew the era and the literature of FDR as well as anybody I've ever met. And no one helped me more in understanding Roosevelt and the people around him and the sources of information about him than he did. He was wise in his counsel and generous with his time, writing me memos early in the process, reading drafts, and offering constant support and encouragement. Sadly, Mike died a few weeks ago, and so he obviously can't be here, and so I can't thank him in person tonight. But instead, I would like to dedicate this evening's program to his memory, Michael Janeway. I want to say just a word about how I came to this subject of FDR's deciding to run for a third term. FDR has always been a presence in my life. I was born actually shortly after he was reelected to a second term. I don't remember that really well, but he really never reached my consciousness until I got to Williams College, not far from here, and I was lucky enough to have James McGregor Burns as my political science professor my first freshman year. Not a bad start. And he, of course, wrote one of the classic biographies of Roosevelt and introduced me to him. I returned to my home state of Minnesota and became involved in the politics of the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, which are very much the politics of the New Deal and of Franklin Roosevelt. At that time, it was in the form of Hubert Humphrey, who was one of my early mentors, and he had been hugely influenced by FDR. And so the rest of us were too. And then I immersed myself in reading American history as much as I could. And I was fortunate enough, after my political experience in Minnesota, to be able to serve in the Carter-Mondale White House. And this really brought me face to face with the presidency itself, which I'd never had a chance to witness before. And I became particularly interested in decision-making, presidential decision-making, and leadership. And that brought me right back to FDR. So why do we need another book on FDR? There have probably been more books written on FDR than any other president, except Lincoln, and FDR is a close second, I would guess. Well, almost everything that's been written about FDR has been written either about the New Deal years or the World War II years. And almost nothing, I discovered, had been written about this decision to run for a third term, which I see as the connective tissue between the two epical achievements of FDR, the New Deal, and his leadership in World War II. I was amazed to find that nobody had ever taken this subject on in a serious way before. And it turned out, in my mind at least, that this was one of the most consequential periods in American history, and the decisions that he made were hugely consequential for the future of this country and for the future of the world. So it just leapt out at me, and I just dove into it and had a wonderful time doing it. I tried to get into FDR's head, which, as others have discovered, is not an easy thing to do. On the contrary, it's very difficult. He left no memoir, unlike all of his successors, with the exception of John F. Kennedy, and he didn't confide a lot in his friends and his co-workers. I think one of the best summaries of Roosevelt was written by Francis Perkins, who knew him well, knew him longer than almost anybody that served with him. And here's what she wrote after his death. Franklin Roosevelt was not a simple man. That quality of simplicity which we delight to think marks the great and noble was not his. He was the most complicated human being I ever knew. And out of this complicated nature there sprang much of the drive which brought achievement. It made it possible for him to have insight and imagination into the most varied human experiences. And this he applied to the physical, social, geographical, economic, and strategic circumstances thrust upon him as responsibilities of his time. Now, this story starts essentially in September of 1939. You recall FDR had been hugely reelected in 1936. He immediately got into trouble with the Congress and the country when he set up an ill-conceived what came to be known as the court-packing plan. He took his foot off the economic accelerator. The country, 2 million more people were unemployed. The country did a tailspin into what was called the Roosevelt recession. And then he tried his ill-fated purge of recalcitrant Democrats who hadn't supported his plan. So he made a lot of bad decisions. And his popularity was at its lowest ebb at this point in 1939 of his entire presidency. The New Deal had clearly run its course. You know, he's already shifting his gears from domestic policy to foreign policy because of what was happening in Europe. We'll get to that in a minute. But at the same time, FDR had planned to retire to Hyde Park. A lot of people think that his decision to run for a third term was inevitable. They always planned to do it. I don't agree with that. He had signed a lucrative contract with Collier's magazine to write regular articles. He was building this library. It was well underway at that point. He'd already built Top Cottage. He was bringing files and artifacts back from the White House every time he came back. And Harry Hopkins and Sam Roseman had agreed to come up here and help him do his writing his memoirs. So he was set on retirement. He was satisfied with that. Everybody was aware of the Washington and Jefferson precedent of serving only 2 terms, and he had no interest in challenging that. Then in September of 1939, Hitler invades Poland. This is the beginning of World War II. It wasn't a fighting war yet, but it was very clear that it was going to become a fighting war. Hitler had already swallowed the Rhineland, Austria, the Sudetenland, Czechoslovakia. Britain and France declare war on the invasion of Poland. FDR is struggling with a way to try to find a way to help Britain and France, because he knows that this war is inevitably going to affect the United States in a very direct way. He soon concludes that the war is coming to the United States. And this governs his thinking almost exclusively from this point on. He couldn't find a policy to really influence events in Europe because the United States did not have any military capacity that was credible at this point. And the country was heavily isolationist. There was still a bad after effect from our involvement in World War I. There was this feeling in the country that we had no business over there. And we certainly didn't have any business over there again because of the cost and the ingratitude that followed our first experience in Europe. Large numbers of people saw giving aid to Britain and France and others as a slippery slope to war. So he very surreptitiously tries to build a first line of defense for the United States through Britain and France, and he does that in ways that I'm not going to get into tonight. But he was really facing, I think, one of the greatest problems that any president of the United States had faced since Lincoln had to decide whether or not to reinforce Fort Sumter. Because it was a question of war and peace. The stakes were enormously high. And he wrestled with this policy literally by himself. You have to take yourself back in time almost 75 years. There was no National Security Council in the White House. There was no substantive staff of any kind in the White House. He didn't have an intelligence organization to tell him what was really going on. There was no OSS. That didn't come until 1941, and the CIA, of course, much later. So he's wrestling with these policies and trying to do what he can, surreptitiously for the most part, to try to assert U.S. influence abroad. Meanwhile, there's growing pressure on him to state his intentions of what he really will do in terms of the 1940 election. Will he run again? So that third term talk grows, and the press keeps pestering him as to whether or not he will declare whether he'll run or not. Well, he won't declare. He won't say anything. He was very skillful at avoiding these kinds of tough questions, and the press starts calling him a sphinx. And at the Gridiron Dinner, where the press annually roasts those in power, they serenaded FDR, who was in the audience, and saying, tell us, oh great one, will you run? and out onto the stage was this 8-foot-tall papier-mâché Sphinx with FDR's head, cigarette holder at a jaunty angle. FDR enjoyed it so much, he said, "I want that Sphinx." And guess where it is now? It's across the street in the museum, on display once again. So there are really two major storylines going on here: the war in Europe and will he run? And these two storylines are inextricably intertwined, and that's really the essence of this story, is that these two things influence each other. In May of 1940, real war breaks out in Europe. Hitler invades France and the Low Countries. France falls. Britain is hanging by a thread. And Britain is the only thing standing in the way of Hitler greatly expanding his forces worldwide. And FDR has no doubt that the United States is going to be seriously at risk if Britain falls. This event also sharpens his focus on whether or not he's going to run again. And because the Democratic National Convention is scheduled to open in Chicago in just 2 months. Let me just say a word about FDR's decision-making process, which is one of the things that really fascinated me about this question, writing this book. As I said, I don't think it was inevitable that he was going to run. There's no evidence to support that, even though many assumed he was running. William Leuchtenberg, one of the great FDR scholars, told me when I asked him about this, he said, "Well, it's an interesting question whether or not he wanted to run. The only thing we know for certain about Franklin Delano Roosevelt is that he never left the presidency voluntarily," which is true. It doesn't answer the question, though. But he made this decision, and he made it entirely alone. There is no evidence that from September of 1939 to just days before the convention in mid-July 1940, that he talked to another individual about this decision of whether or not he should run. A lot of people were urging him to do something, one way or the other. A lot of people were urging him to run. Democrats were almost panic-stricken because they didn't see anybody else. But he wouldn't tell anybody what he was going to do. He almost always waited until the last minute before he made a major decision. His decision-making process evolved. It was never kind of a light bulb going off. It was almost always a gradual process. And that's what happened here. So what did I learn about who FDR was? Well, many of you are experts on this subject, but I'll just tell you what I learned. He was a famously social person. He always wanted people around him. But essentially, he was a very solitary person. He was a loner. He grew up as an only child on a remote estate right here in rural upstate New York. Few friends, and that continued through his youth and early adulthood. Very few close friends. And throughout almost all of his life, almost no intimate friends. Eleanor said once, he had no real confidants, not even me. Robert Sherwood, the great biographer of Roosevelt and Hopkins, said something that really struck me, and I think has struck others, and that really summarizes who Roosevelt was in this respect. He said Franklin Roosevelt had a thickly forested interior. Think about that phrase, a thickly forested interior. He didn't want anybody penetrating that forest to understand what was going on inside. That, I think, captures it very, very well. What I also discovered, but I was not alone in this, is the duality that was Franklin Roosevelt. He was bold, perceptive, prescient, and a moral statesman, and he set very principled goals for the country. I think that's unarguable, whether you support those goals or not. But in pursuing those goals, he could be cautious, he could be ambitious, sometimes arrogant and manipulative, and even duplicitous. That's the great contradiction. That's the duality that was Franklin Roosevelt in many instances. But I don't think any episode of his presidency shows that more clearly, that duality more clearly than these events. 4 days before the Chicago Convention, he calls Felix Frankfurter down from the Supreme Court. And they spend 2 hours up in the Oval Study, not to be confused with the Oval Office in the White House, talking about whether or not he is justified in running for a third term. This weighed heavily on it. There is no record of that conversation on the part of either of them. The only thing we know for certain is that at the end of the conversation, Roosevelt asked Frankfurter to write him a memo on what he had just told him on this very consequential question. And Frankfurter said he would, but he would like to request one also from Archibald MacLeish, then the Librarian of Congress, also appointed by FDR. Roosevelt said, "Fine, but keep it quiet and make it fast. I don't have much time here." The next day, Frankfurter returned to the White House with 2 memos, one handwritten by himself and one typewritten by Archibald MacLeish. These two memos, I believe, are the best window into FDR's mind on this question at this time, whether he should run for a third term and whether or not he was justified in doing it. It's really the ultimate political mystery. What was going on in the president's head, even as the outcome is well known? Well, I think the memos are so important that I had them reprinted in their entirety in the appendix. Now, I could tell you what's in those memos, but then you might not buy the book. See? So, but we do know that he did run. And he did run in the end because of the war, because of the emergency facing the United States as a result of the war and what was likely to happen to Britain if the United States did not come to its aid. He saw war coming to the United States. He was very prescient in that sense. And he was prepared to go to great lengths to help Britain to do that. In the end, he could not find another Democrat, somebody who would support the New Deal, who would support aid to Britain, and who could be elected. And he went through a number of prospects. He begged Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, almost until the last minute to do this, and Hull said no. So in effect, he offered himself to the party and to the nation. And it set the stage for a very dramatic convention. Some of it scripted, most of it unscripted. And it almost came to a very sad ending for Roosevelt, but it was averted. And one of the reasons why it was averted was because of Frances Perkins, who, as I said, knew him longer from 1910 until his death. And she had great respect from Roosevelt. The members of the cabinet wanted her fired because she talked too much at cabinet meetings. He respected her deeply. And she arranged something with Eleanor Roosevelt, I can go into this later if you want, that saved Roosevelt from himself at that convention. Otherwise, it could have spun into chaos. And this was at a time when women were not at the table politically, not present. But she asserted herself in a way that had an extraordinary effect and a beneficial effect for Roosevelt and I think for the country. There were other characters in this story, fascinating cast of characters. Charles A. Lindbergh, leader of the isolationist movement, great aviation hero, but incredibly naive in my view about what was going on in the world and the consequences of what he was doing. He and Roosevelt met only once, and it was just kind of a cordial meeting after Lindbergh came back from Europe. Roosevelt really detested him. And he told Henry Morgenthau early in 1940, he said, "If I die tomorrow, remember that Charles A. Lindbergh is a Nazi." Well, Charles Lindbergh was not a Nazi, but Roosevelt had very strong feelings about it. Wendell Willkie is another heroic figure in my view. He, of course, was the Republican candidate, Republican nominee for president that year of 1940, and He came from nowhere. It was a classic dark horse coming from nowhere. He's very highly charismatic. He was a Midwesterner, head of a utilities company. He was a New Deal Democrat until a year before the election, before he started running. He was an internationalist, strongly supported aid to Britain. But he disagreed with Roosevelt on some regulatory issues and some economic issues. And in any case, he got it in his mind that he was going to run, and he succeeded in getting the Republican nomination. At that convention in Philadelphia in June of 1940, there was a lot of resentment towards him because he had been a Democrat until very recently. Well, by chance, he ran into a former senator from Indiana, and he himself was in Indiana, who was part of the old guard Republican establishment, clearly didn't have much use for Wilkie. And he said, Wendell, you're not my kind of Republican. And Wilkie danced around a little bit and said, well, it's true that I was a Democrat, but now I'm a Republican, and I want to be the Republican nominee for all the right reasons. And this senator, Watson, I think his name was, said, Wendell, back in Indiana, we let the town whore into church, but we usually don't let her lead the choir the first night out. Well, in spite of that, he got nominated. And he was a real hero in this story because he supported, as did Roosevelt, the first peacetime draft in American history. This is during the course of the campaign. After the election, he supported Lend-Lease in a way that was hugely crucial to its success. Roosevelt gave him full credit for the passage of Lend-Lease, said we couldn't have done it without him. And yet he did that at great political cost to himself because he wanted to be nominated again in 1944. And that destroyed his chances for doing that. Winston Churchill obviously spent a fair amount of time with Roosevelt, including here at Hyde Park. And he was trying to work out a deal of trading destroyers, old U.S. destroyers from World War I, in turn for British bases in the Western Hemisphere. And it was a very complicated deal. And finally, Roosevelt found a way to do it without going to Congress, which appealed to him. He didn't like to have to deal with Congress on these things. But Churchill was afraid that Roosevelt was, because of the nature of the deal, it had to be a trade. It couldn't be just be gifts either way. It had to be what was called a bargain. And so Roosevelt arranged this conference call with Churchill, and he got Robert Jackson as Attorney General on the phone and said, I'm sorry, Winston, we just can't do this without having a trade here. And as Jackson said, it has to be a bargain because of the constitutional restraints on us here. Well, Churchill said, empires just don't bargain. Well, republics do, Jackson said. And Roosevelt was trying to cover this thing up and trying to smooth things out. He says, the trouble, Winston, is I have an attorney general, and he says I have to bargain. Churchill said, well, maybe you ought to trade these destroyers for a new attorney general. Anyway, they got it all worked out. In the general election after the convention, FDR ran basically as commander-in-chief. He pretended he didn't have an opponent, and he just visited military bases and arms factories and so forth. It was a variation of what we call the Rose Garden strategy. But Wilkie smoked him out and ultimately made the war the issue at the urging of the old guard Republicans, because it was the only issue people cared about. They saw what was happening in Europe. They knew war was likely to come to the United States. And who did they want to lead this country through the war? Making war the issue tightened the race enormously. Roosevelt had a double-digit lead coming out of the convention, and he held it pretty much until Wilkie started calling him a warmonger and said, if you elect Roosevelt, there are going to be U.S. troops on the transports in April. That really shook things up. And Roosevelt was very, very worried. And on election night, over here in the big house, he was in the dining room receiving returns, as he usually did on election night. with the teletypes spinning off the early returns in the corner, and Ed Flynn calling them up from the Biltmore in New York. And Roosevelt was convinced he was going to lose. He turned to his chief of Secret Service detail, Mike Riley, and said, "Mike, close that door. I don't want to see anyone." He said, "Including your family, Mr. President?" He said, I mean anyone." And Mike Riley, who had covered him, who had protected him for 2 terms, said he had never seen him lose his nerve before. But that night, he concluded he lost his nerve. He broke out into a sweat and shut himself up in the dining room of the big house for almost an hour, because he saw something in those early returns that convinced him he was going to lose. And there's been a lot of speculation on what he thought of during that time, but he never mentioned it to anybody. But it's a fascinating subject to consider. Well, of course, he won the election, and the doors were open. People poured in, congratulated him, and for the first time in American history, and maybe the only time in American history, a president was elected to a 3rd term. This decision to run for a 3rd term and the election itself had huge consequences for the nation, because it put in place a man of extraordinary leadership to lead this country through World War II, lead this country and the world through World War II. This decision began the eclipse of isolationism in the United States. For better or worse, the United States has been engaged in the world ever since. And the Lend-Lease and the Destroyer deal planted the seeds of the national security state that we have today. It also changed the way we think of the presidency and candidates for the presidency, because now we think, among other things, can this person be entrusted with the safety of the American people and threats abroad? I think it's one of the most consequential elections in American history. It's right up there with 1864, when Lincoln ran for re-election. And it's an extraordinary example of presidential leadership. He set his sights on saving Britain and giving the United States time to prepare for a war he knew was coming. He concluded that only he could do that if he ran again, and he did. It was a messy process. It was not always pretty, but in my view, it got the right result for the country. We will never know fully what was in FDR's mind and what he was thinking during this time, but this book is simply my attempt, my own effort, to try to penetrate that thickly forested interior that Robert Sherwood described. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd be happy to take some questions, and I think Cliff has a mic down there. Yes, right here.
Yes, I was wondering if you got anything out of the writings of FDR to his cousin Daisy Suckley, who lived at Wilderstein up the road.
No, I'm fascinated by this subject because if he had any intimate friends, she was certainly among them. Yeah. And I can conceive of his talking with her about this question. But as many of you may know, when her diaries appeared, I think shortly after her death, in a suitcase in her house, the year 1940 was missing and remains missing. So we don't know. We don't know what was in those diaries, and we don't know why it's not there. Believe me, I looked for it, and I did not find it, because I thought if there's any insight on anyone else's part on what was in his head. I mean, as I said, the goal was to try to get into FDR's head, and she would know that as well as anybody. But unfortunately, to no avail. Yes, sir.
In the book, you present the memo that he wrote in longhand during the convention when the Wallace nomination. Is that in the same category of what you've just described? of his profound uncertainty?
Well, that's a really interesting question. This is to get to the nub of it, this is what Francis Perkins saved FDR from. He wrote a memo when the roll call started for vice president. Remember, FDR wanted Henry Wallace to be his vice president, in whose name this bears. Because he wanted a liberal, he wanted an internationalist, and he wanted somebody who he could trust, and that was Henry Wallace. A lot of the old style, the old Pauls, did not want Henry Wallace. They saw him as unstable, as uncertain, and recently a Republican. So they rebelled. And they also thought that the vice presidency it was their prerogative. It wasn't their prerogative. FDR was the first president to name, the first presidential nominee to name his own vice presidential nominee. That's had huge consequences. And he said, when the roll call started, Wallace was well behind, and he asked Missy Lehand for a pencil and paper, and he started drafting a memo. And the essence of the memo was that if he was going to issue this statement publicly, declining the nomination. He had sounds like a Democratic convention to me. He was going to decline the nomination, and that would have happened if Francis Perkins hadn't conspired to bring Eleanor Roosevelt to the convention to make a very calm, reasoned speech about how the President of the United States at this time needed a choice of his own to help steer it through. And if she hadn't come and made that speech, and if Francis Perkins hadn't engineered that, he was prepared to issue this, which would have created enormous chaos. Who knows what would have happened? But it would have totally changed the dynamic of the election, and FDR may or may not have changed his mind. I don't know. We'll never know. But it was a huge risk, and one that nobody who cared about the country, at least at that point, wanted to see. So that fell into a different category, and I think he was a victim of his own arrogance when he did that, and he could do that from time to time, as we all know. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm old enough, I remember the 40 election very well. And in retrospect, from years after, Wallace was very politically naive, especially in foreign policy. And have you any thoughts on that? Roosevelt apparently was not aware of his naivete.
I think that's correct, particularly where the Soviet Union was concerned, and that was not an issue in 1940. He didn't have any other serious candidates. He had a lot of potential candidates, but he eliminated them one by one until he got down to Wallace. But I think you have a point that he hadn't really thought that. He didn't know Wallace that well. But Wallace was probably the most ardent supporter of the New Deal in the cabinet. And I think that carried great weight with FDR. But I think you have a point on foreign policy, because that was not his field, and he certainly hadn't gotten into it very deeply. Yes, sir.
Also, he would have helped to bring in the farm vote, which was pretty important.
That's right. That's right.
My question is, during this period of time, there were numerous peace feelers that came, mainly apparently out of Germany, but other people too. There was a number of Americans who simply did not want the war, as you well know, and they weren't Nazis. And was there another way out of that? So the peace feelers that were there, there's I think a creditable idea that I don't think has ever been pursued. Do you encounter FDR ever, or with Churchill, in the conversations in which even the term, the peace feeler, was there, where there might be a chance to turn the damn thing around?
I don't think so. But there are others more expert on this than I am. I do know that in 1938-39, when Hitler was on the march in Austria and the Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia, there was a lot of pressure coming from Europe for Roosevelt to come in and broker the peace at that point. Joe Kennedy was one of the people that was trying to do that. But FDR didn't think that he had any leverage on anybody, and most importantly, he didn't want to give Hitler any sanction. He didn't want to approve some kind of deal that he would feel bound by, because he detested Hitler. I do mention in the book that shortly after Dunkirk, Churchill had a major problem with his own war cabinet in terms of trying to broker a deal through Italy with Hitler, and Churchill was adamant in not doing it. And one of the great fears that FDR had was that Britain would feel so much pressure that they would cut a deal with Hitler, and he deeply hoped that would not happen. There's nothing that reassured Roosevelt more about Britain than when Churchill gave the order to destroy the French fleet in North Africa. Then he knew Churchill was serious. So that leads me to believe that he was not in favor of any kind of brokered peace and I think things had gone much too far at that point. But
That wasn't part of the deal.
I'm,
Wasn't that part of the deal that the French could save their fleet?
well, I don't know that was ever surfaced, but in any case, the French were given a chance to demobilize their fleet, and they did not take it. This is Vichy France, and so Churchill took them out.
This meeting with Frankfurt, was that to go over like the constitutional issue of running for a third term, or?
No, good question. It wasn't about the politics. It wasn't about the law, because the Constitution was silent on a third term, and others had tried to achieve a third term, and nobody ever raised a constitutional issue about it. No, it was whether or not he was justified by the circumstances facing the country to challenge the precedent set down by Washington and Jefferson, which was regarded as almost sacrosanct by a lot of people, including most of the American people, because nobody had ever succeeded in doing it. So he really wanted his counsel as a wise man, not as a politician. Didn't need any personal advice, but was he justified in doing this? And he had enormous respect for Frankfurter, and so it was simply. But it's a fascinating memo. It's a fascinating set of memos. So I urge you to read them. Yes, sir.
Could I follow up on that? At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned that he was at the leader of this conflict
Yes.
in 1939.
Yes.
How do you account for the fact that no contenders appeared on the scene, particularly given the fact that this third-term issue was out there? And the other thing, I'd just like to know, when did you seize upon this very fascinating question? Was it in the middle of the night, suddenly? How did you make the connection with the epiphany? So two separate.
Well, I wish I could say that I had an epiphany, but I didn't. It was suggested to me by a friend who was going to write this book and decided for a number of reasons he wasn't going to do it. So he urged me to look into it, and I did. I'm sorry, what was the first question?
Well, the first question was why the absence of contenders. I'm thinking.
Oh, yeah. He froze the field. He knew what he was doing. By refusing to discuss the issue either way, he froze the field, because there was always this possibility he was going to run again, even though he was. So nobody wanted to get crossways with Franklin Roosevelt. It wasn't a good thing to do for the most part. So very few stuck their head up. The only two that really declared were John Nance Garner, who was embittered at this point. FDR couldn't stand him, and he basically went off to Texas, but he was just trying to stir up trouble. And Jim Farley, of all people, who had supported him, who had managed his previous campaigns. And Farley thought, incredibly, thought he could be president of the United States. Having read a fair amount about, I didn't know Jim Farley, but I couldn't conceive of him being president of the United States, or even putting himself on. And there's no way FDR would have allowed that to happen. And they had had a falling out in 39 and 40 anyway. And but it's a good question why others didn't pop up. I mean, Paul McNutt from Indiana, well, he didn't go very far, but there were no credible, serious candidates.
About Joe Kennedy, just the fact that Teddy challenged part of what he would have liked.
Right. Oh yeah, I remember that. He was interested in being president, but not in 1940. I mean, he kind of toyed around with it, but then he came out for the third term at one point. And but he could not have been. I mean, if we have to put ourselves back in time, Joe Kennedy was the leading Catholic layman in America at that time. Al Smith had just gone down to huge defeat a decade before, in 1928, and there was great reticence about either party putting a Catholic on the ticket. So that wasn't likely to happen. But it is an interesting question why there weren't more candidates.
You mentioned, sir, that Roosevelt was influenced by Hitler's actions in 1939. Are you aware of any reason to think the reverse, that Hitler was in any way aware of the American political system and cared who might be the next president, and not his timing might have been affected by that?
I don't know. I have no idea what was in Hitler's mind, but I doubt that FDR had a lot of trouble being heard. I mean, he once sent a letter to Hitler that was urging him to stand down on something or other, and Hitler waited a few days and then gave a mocking speech in front of the Reichstag about FDR, just mocking him, worse than any Republican had ever done. And obviously had contempt for Roosevelt and for the United States. Did not think the United States was consequential in this concern, and militarily it wasn't. Well,
What was his medical condition at that time? Did it influence him one way or the other?
that's a good question. He certainly wasn't in bad condition, but he had had a mild heart attack in February of 1940, and Ross McIntyre, his physician, had treated him. Didn't take it very seriously, and he did. He was not well. His polio obviously had after effects. He led a very sedentary life, and there were results of his not being able to be active. But for the most part, I think he was fit to run for re-election that year, unlike 1944, when, in my view, he clearly wasn't fit. Yes, sir.
Just to add a footnote to something that you emphasized as well. I speak as the chair of the Francis Perkins Center.
Right.
And
Thank you for that.
I knew her, in fact, conducted two seminars, one with Henry Wallace and one with Jim Farley at Cornell. So I had a sense of her with these two people. And one of the things she focused on is that she also is the one that is with Roosevelt when he finally decides that Henry Wallace is the one and sends her out.
That's exactly right.
So she played a very critical role through these several weeks.
She did indeed, and she had earlier urged him to pick Wallace. That's right. That's right. And you are helping to save the Francis Perkins House in Maine.
Which you have helped us do.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Let's hear it for Francis. You've been okay. You've been a wonderful crowd. I really appreciate your coming tonight. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing.